let me tell you a fundamental truth about fear. In Egypt, we grow up surrounded by noise. Cairo is a city that never sleeps, never stops breathing, never shuts up. There is always a car honking, a street vendor shouting, the sound of a television blaring from a balcony 3 streets away. We complain about it, sure. We say it gives us headaches. But the truth is, that noise is a blanket. It protects you. Because when there is noise, you know you are not alone. You know the world is still turning. I didn't understand how heavy silence could be until I inherited the house in Blackwood. My name is Youssef. I'm 32, an architect by trade, and until 6 months ago, my biggest problem was dealing with stubborn contractors in Giza. Then, I got a phone call from a lawyer representing the estate of my late Uncle Farid. Uncle Farid was the black sheep of our family. He left Egypt in the late 80s, moved to the United States, and settled in the dense, freezing, perpetually rain-soaked Pacific Northwest. He made a fortune in timber, but he never married, never had kids, and never came back to visit. My mother used to say he had a shadow on his soul. I thought she was just being poetic. Arabs love drama, you know. But when the lawyer told me that Farid had died and left his entire estate, including a massive, isolated property deep in the Oregon mountains, to me, his only nephew, I thought it was a joke. It wasn't a joke. It was a trap. I just didn't know it yet. I was burned out, exhausted from my life, and going through a miserable breakup. The idea of a free house in America, a place surrounded by nature where I could reset my brain, sounded like a miracle. I packed 2 suitcases, sold my car, and got on a plane. The drive up to Blackwood should have been my first warning. I rented a heavy SUV at the airport in Portland and drove for 4 hours into the mountains. The higher I got, the more the world seemed to drain of color. The sky was a bruised, heavy gray. The pine trees on either side of the winding mountain road were massive, towering over the asphalt like ancient, silent guards. They grew so tightly together that the forest looked like a solid wall of black wood. The fog rolled down the mountainsides, thick and wet, clinging to the windshield. I lost my cell phone signal 2 hours before I even reached the town. By the time I turned onto the private dirt road leading to Uncle Farid's property, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, skeletal shadows across the mud. The property was known locally as the Glasswood House, though I had no idea why until I pulled the SUV up to the front driveway and put the car in park. I sat there for a full 5 minutes, the engine idling, just staring at the place. As an architect, I appreciate unique design. But this was wrong. The house was massive, a sprawling Victorian-style mansion built from dark, weather-beaten timber. But it was the windows that made my stomach tighten. There were too many of them. The front facade was covered in tall, narrow, asymmetrical windows that looked like wide, staring eyes. They didn't follow any logical floor plan. Some were near the floor, some were shoved awkwardly into the corners of the ceiling. It gave the house an insect-like appearance, a multi-eyed monstrosity sitting silently in the middle of a dead clearing. "All right, Youssef," I muttered to myself, killing the engine. "It's just an old man's eccentric taste. Don't be a coward." I grabbed my heavy coat, took the brass key the lawyer had mailed me, and walked up the creaking wooden steps to the front porch. The key turned with a heavy, satisfying clack, and the thick oak door swung open. The smell hit me first. It wasn't the smell of rot or decay, which would have been understandable. It smelled like dried lavender, old paper, and copper. Like a handful of old coins. It was a sharp, metallic tang that coated the back of my throat. I fumbled for the light switch on the wall and flicked it. Miraculously, the electricity was still connected. A series of warm, amber bulbs flickered to life, illuminating the main hallway. And that is when I discovered the true horror of Uncle Farid's architectural madness. The outside of the house had too many windows. But the inside of the house, the inside was a labyrinth of glass. There were interior windows everywhere. I stood in the main hallway, taking off my boots, and looked to my left. There was a large, glass-paned window built directly into the interior wall, looking straight into the dark living room. I walked a few steps further. On my right, another interior window looked into what appeared to be a dining room. I looked up. Near the ceiling of the hallway, a small, horizontal window offered a view into the upstairs landing. Why? Why would anyone build a house like this? A window is meant to look outside, to let the light in. Interior windows serve only one purpose: they allow you to see from one room into the next. They remove privacy. They enforce observation. Uncle Farid hadn't built a home. He had built a panopticon. He had built a house where you could never, ever be truly out of sight, even if you were the only person living in it. I spent the next 2 hours exploring the ground floor, my unease growing with every step. The furniture was heavy, antique, and draped in white dust covers that looked like ghosts crouching in the corners. Every room I walked into had at least one window looking into another room. If you stood in the kitchen, you could see into the study. If you stood in the study, you could see into the hallway. It made me feel incredibly exposed. Even though I knew I was alone, miles away from the nearest human being, the architecture itself made me feel like I was being watched. Every time I passed one of those interior glass panes, my own reflection would catch the corner of my eye, making my heart jump before logic kicked in. Just a weird old man, I kept telling myself, my voice sounding incredibly loud and hollow in the absolute silence of the house. He probably got lonely. Wanted the house to feel more open. I found the master bedroom on the second floor. Thankfully, this room seemed relatively normal. It was large, with a massive four-poster bed, a heavy oak wardrobe, and thick, burgundy curtains blocking out the darkening forest outside. But, true to the house's nature, there was one interior window. It was located on the wall directly opposite the bed, about 4 feet off the ground. It looked out into the pitch-black upstairs hallway. I didn't like it. I didn't like the idea of lying in bed and staring out into the dark, empty corridor. I looked around for a curtain or a blind to pull over it, but there was nothing. Just bare glass, reflecting the dim light of the bedroom lamp. Exhaustion finally began to overpower my paranoia. I had been traveling for almost 24 hours. My body was aching, my eyes were burning, and the jet lag was hitting me like a physical blow. I didn't even bother unpacking. I just grabbed a pair of sweatpants from my suitcase, changed, and collapsed onto the massive bed. The mattress was surprisingly comfortable, swallowing my weight. I turned off the bedside lamp. Instantly, the darkness clamped down on me. I mentioned the silence before, but I need to emphasize it. It wasn't just quiet, it was a heavy, suffocating absence of sound. No wind. No crickets. No hum of traffic. Just the sound of my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. I closed my eyes, desperately trying to force my brain to shut down. I thought about Cairo. I thought about the smell of shisha smoke and grilled meat by the Nile. I tried to anchor myself in familiar memories. I must have drifted off, hovering in that strange, murky space between being awake and being asleep. You know that feeling? When your body is heavy, but your mind is still vaguely aware of your surroundings. I don't know what time it was when the atmosphere in the room shifted. It wasn't a sudden noise that woke me. It was a drop in temperature. A sudden, biting cold that seeped through the heavy quilt and raised the hairs on my arms. And with the cold came a feeling of immense, paralyzing pressure. I tried to open my eyes. My eyelids fluttered, feeling like they were glued shut, but I managed to pry them open just a slit. The room was bathed in the pale, silver glow of the moonlight filtering through a gap in the burgundy curtains. I tried to sit up. I couldn't. My body was completely, utterly locked. It felt as if a concrete slab had been dropped directly onto my chest. I tried to lift my arm, to move my fingers, to turn my head. Nothing. The panic flared instantly, hot and sharp. Sleep paralysis. I had read about it, heard stories about it, but I had never experienced it. My brain was fully conscious, but the chemical switch that keeps your body still during REM sleep hadn't turned off. I was a prisoner in my own flesh. Breathe, Yusef. Just breathe. It's a physiological glitch. It will pass. I repeated the words in my mind frantically. Then, the sound started. It was a low, electrical buzzing, like the hum of a dying refrigerator, vibrating right at the edge of my hearing. But underneath the buzzing, there was something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps. And they weren't coming from outside the house. They were coming from the upstairs hallway. Thud, creak, thud, creak. They were moving at a measured pace, taking their absolute time, walking down the long corridor toward the master bedroom. My heart began to slam against my ribs so violently I thought my chest would crack. I tried to scream, to force any sound out of my paralyzed throat, but all that came out was a pathetic, suffocated wheeze. The footsteps stopped. They stopped right outside my bedroom door. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my eyes wide with a primal, animalistic terror. I was waiting for the door handle to turn. I was waiting for the heavy oak door to swing open. But it didn't. Instead, the whispering began. It was coming from the interior window. The one directly opposite my bed. The one that looked out into the hallway. At first, I couldn't make out the words. It was just a wet, raspy murmuring, like someone speaking through a mouthful of sand. But as I strained my ears, entirely against my own will, the voice became clearer. It was my mother's voice. Yusef. It whispered. Yusef, Habibi, why did you come here? You shouldn't be here. It's so cold in the dark, Yusef. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes. My mother was back in Egypt. She was alive and well, thousands of miles away. But the voice, the cadence, the Egyptian accent, the specific way she said, Habibi, it was flawless. It was a perfect, impossible replication. Let me in, Yusef, the voice pleaded, shifting from a whisper to a desperate, whining cry. Open the door. I can't see anything. It's looking at me. Yusef, it's looking at me. I fought against the paralysis with every ounce of willpower I possessed. I focused all my energy on my right index finger, trying to force it to twitch, to break the spell. But my body remained dead. Then, the voice stopped crying. The silence rushed back in for 3 agonizing seconds. When the voice spoke again, it was no longer my mother. It was my voice. "He can't move," my own voice said from the other side of the glass, completely calm, completely flat. "He's awake, but he can't move a muscle." How pathetic. The sheer psychological horror of hearing my own voice speaking to me from an empty hallway nearly broke my mind. In Islamic folklore, we have the concept of the Qareen, a spiritual double, a shadow self assigned to every human being, constantly whispering dark thoughts. I had never believed in it. It was just a story to scare children. But hearing my exact vocal cords vibrating in the dark outside my room tore away every rational defense I had. With a monumental, agonizing effort, I managed to roll my eyes downward, dragging my line of sight from the ceiling down to the interior window opposite the bed. The moonlight hit the glass just right. There was a face pressed against the pane, looking in at me. It was pale. Impossibly, sickeningly pale, like marble left out in the snow. The features were blurry, slightly out of focus, as if the flesh was still trying to decide what shape to take. But the eyes were clear. They were wide, dark, and locked directly onto mine. It was my face. It was a twisted, grotesque copy of my own face, staring back at me through the interior window. The mimic slowly raised a hand and pressed its palm flat against the glass on the hallway side. Its fingers were too long, the joints too pronounced. It tilted its head to the side, maintaining that dead, unblinking eye contact. And then, my face smiled at me. It wasn't a normal smile. The corners of its mouth stretched too far, pulling back to reveal rows of perfectly white, unnaturally sharp teeth. "I'm going to come inside now, Yusef," my voice echoed from the hallway, though the thing's lips didn't move. The sound of glass cracking shattered the silence. A long, jagged fracture appeared on the interior window, right under the mimic's palm. Crack. Another fracture webbing outward. It was pushing. It was trying to break through. Adrenaline, pure and explosive, finally overwhelmed the chemical lock in my brain. With a gasp that sounded like a dying man taking his first breath, my body violently jerked awake. The paralysis broke. I shot up in bed, scrambling backward until my spine slammed hard against the heavy wooden headboard, my hands frantically grabbing the quilt like a shield. I stared at the interior window, my chest heaving, sweat pouring down my face in freezing sheets. The window was empty. There was no pale face. There was no mimic. There was no shattered glass. Just the pristine, unbroken pane reflecting the moonlight, looking out into the empty, silent hallway. I sat there for an hour, my knees pulled up to my chest, refusing to blink, refusing to move. I told myself it was a hallucination. A textbook case of sleep paralysis brought on by jet lag, stress, and the creepy architecture of my dead uncle's house. The brain is a powerful organ. It can conjure nightmares that feel more real than reality itself. That is what I desperately wanted to believe. But as the first gray light of morning began to bleed through the burgundy curtains, I slowly lowered my legs and walked over to the interior window. I stood in front of the glass, looking out into the hallway. And there, on the hallway side of the glass, perfectly clear in the morning light, was a single, greasy handprint. The fingers were far too long to be human. In Egypt, we have a very specific, unspoken rule about the supernatural. If you walk into a place, a dark alley in Islamic Cairo, an empty stairwell in an old Alexandria apartment, or a quiet room, and your stomach suddenly drops to your knees, you leave. You don't stay to investigate. You don't pull out a flashlight and ask, "Is anyone there?" like the white people do in those American horror movies. You recite Ayat al-Kursi under your breath, you turn around, and you walk away. You do not test the things that live in the unseen. Standing in front of that interior window, staring at the greasy, elongated handprint on the glass, that primal Egyptian instinct kicked in with the force of a speeding train. I didn't try to rationalize it anymore. I didn't try to tell myself it was a smudge from a careless contractor or a trick of the morning light filtering through the dust. The handprint was on the outside of my bedroom door, in the hallway. And the fingers. God, the fingers were drawn out, tapering into sharp, unnatural points, at least 2 inches longer than any human hand had the right to be. It looked like the imprint of a spider trying to wear a human glove. No, I said aloud. Just that one word. No. I turned my back on the window, grabbed my 2 suitcases, and didn't even bother trying to fold the sweatpants I had taken out. I shoved them inside, zipped the bags with shaking, clumsy hands, and threw on my heavy winter coat. I was leaving. Uncle Farid's millions, the timber estate, the massive property, none of it mattered. The lawyer could sell it, burn it down, or let the Oregon forest swallow it whole for all I cared. I was going to drive the rental SUV back to Portland, buy a ticket on the first flight out to Cairo, and never speak of the Glasswood house again. I opened the bedroom door, keeping my eyes firmly locked on the floor. I refused to look at the glass pane where the handprint rested. I dragged my suitcases down the long, carpeted upstairs hallway, the wheels squeaking loudly against the oppressive silence of the house. The descent down the main staircase was agonizing. In the daylight, the house was somehow even more terrifying. The gray, bruised Oregon sky offered very little natural light, casting long, pale, sickly shadows across the dark timber floors. But it was the interior windows that made my skin crawl. As I walked, every pane of glass in the house caught my reflection. Dozens of Yusefs, all moving in tandem, dragging suitcases through the house. I kept my head down, terrified that if I looked too closely at one of those reflections, it might stop walking while I kept moving. I reached the front foyer, grabbed my rental keys from the console table, and practically threw my shoulder against the heavy oak front door to force it open. The blast of freezing, damp morning air hit my face, smelling of wet pine needles and ozone. I dragged the bags out onto the porch, breathing heavily, a massive wave of relief washing over me. I had made it out. The nightmare was contained inside the wood and glass. I jogged down the wooden steps to the muddy driveway where I had parked the massive, black SUV the night before. I hit the unlock button on the key fob. Nothing happened. The headlights didn't flash. The horn didn't chirp. I frowned, stepping closer and pressing the button again, harder this time. Nothing. I walked up to the driver's side door and pulled the handle. Locked. I cursed under my breath pluming into white clouds in the freezing air, and popped the manual key out of the fob. I slid it into the lock and turned it. The door clicked open. I climbed into the driver's seat, put the key in the ignition, and turned it. Dead. Not a stutter. Not a click. Not a single dashboard light flickered. It was as if the battery had been entirely vaporized overnight. "You have to be kidding me," I muttered, slamming the heel of my hand against the steering wheel. I popped the hood release lever by my left knee, got out of the car, and walked around to the front. When I lifted the heavy metal hood, my heart stopped for the second time that day. The battery wasn't just dead. It was gone. The heavy, rectangular plastic casing had been violently ripped out of the engine bay. The thick copper cables that were supposed to connect to the terminals had been severed, not cut cleanly with tools, but shredded, chewed apart as if a massive, blunt instrument had gnawed through the metal and rubber. Thick, corrosive battery acid was pooled across the engine block, smoking slightly in the cold air, smelling violently of sulfur. My breathing grew shallow and rapid. An animal? Could a bear do this? A bear wouldn't steal a car battery. A bear wouldn't cleanly avoid the rest of the engine to specifically rip out the power source. I stumbled backward, my boots sliding in the mud, and my foot caught on something hard. I looked down. The front left tire was completely flat. I walked around the vehicle, the dread pooling in my stomach like lead. All 4 tires were flat. Each one had 3 massive, parallel gashes ripped straight through the thick rubber, exposing the steel belting underneath. It looked exactly like the strike of a heavy, 3-fingered claw. I was trapped. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was miles away from the main highway. The town of Blackwood was at least a 4-hour walk through dense, mountainous terrain, and the temperature was hovering right around freezing. Without a car, without a map, and without thermal hiking gear, walking out of here would be suicide. I pulled my cell phone out of my pocket. The screen lit up, mocking me with the symbol in the top corner, no service. I raised it in the air, walking around the driveway in frantic circles, praying for even a single bar of signal. Nothing. The dense Oregon forest and the surrounding mountains created a perfect dead zone. I stared back at the glasswood house. It sat there in the gray light, silent and imposing, its dozens of asymmetrical windows staring back at me like dead, glassy eyes. It had known I would try to leave. Whatever was in there, whatever had spoken to me in my mother's voice, had made sure I couldn't. I had no choice. I had to go back inside. I left the suitcases in the mud. I didn't care about my clothes anymore. I marched back up the wooden steps, my fear slowly crystallizing into a cold, desperate anger. In Egypt, we say, the drowning man will clutch at a straw. I needed a straw. I needed a landline phone. Uncle Farid had lived here for years, he must have had a way to communicate with the outside world. I stepped back into the foyer, leaving the front door wide open. I didn't care if the freezing wind blew into the house, I wanted an escape route. Hello. I yelled, my voice tearing through the silent house. It echoed down the hallways, sharp and abrasive. I know you're here. I know what you did to the car. Silence answered me. Just the hollow, echoing emptiness of the massive structure. I started searching the ground floor, moving with a manic energy. I checked the living room, tearing the white dust covers off the antique sofas, looking for a telephone jack. Nothing. I checked the massive, archaic kitchen. There was a rusted refrigerator, a heavy gas stove, but no phone. Every time I moved from one room to another, the interior windows mocked me. I felt like a rat running through a glass maze. I could see into the empty dining room while standing in the hallway. I could see the stairs from the kitchen. Uncle Farid had designed this place with an obsessive, paranoid need for visibility. I finally found the study at the back of the house. It was a beautiful room, entirely paneled in dark, rich mahogany. A massive, heavy oak desk sat in the center, facing the door. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 of the walls, stuffed with thousands of dusty, leather-bound books. And on the desk, sitting right next to a heavy brass lamp, was a black, rotary-dial telephone. I practically lunged across the room, snatching the heavy receiver off the cradle and pressing it to my ear. I closed my eyes, praying to God for the sweet, monotonous sound of a dial tone. Instead, I heard breathing. It was a slow, wet, rattling inhalation, coming from the other end of the line. It sounded like someone with fluid in their lungs, breathing directly into the mouthpiece. I froze, the heavy plastic receiver pressed against my sweating ear. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice trembling so badly it cracked. "Who is this?" The breathing stopped. For a second, the line was completely dead. Then, a voice spoke. It was my Uncle Farid's voice. I remembered it from old cassette tapes my mother used to play when I was a child. It was deep, gravelly, and heavily accented. "Yusef," the voice rasped, the sound distorted by static. "You shouldn't have opened the door, nephew. The glass was meant to keep them where I could see them. If you can see them, they have to play by the rules." "Uncle Farid?" I gasped, my mind reeling. You're dead," the lawyer said. "They don't like it when you look away, Yusef," the voice continued, ignoring me completely. It didn't sound like a conversation, it sounded like a recording, or something mimicking a recording. I built the windows so I never had to turn my back. But they learned. They learned how to use the reflections. They wear your face so you won't be afraid. Don't look at the mirrors, Yusef. Don't look at the glass. Then, the voice shifted. The gravelly tone of an old Egyptian man morphed, seamlessly and terrifyingly, back into my own voice. "I'm wearing your face right now, Yusef," my voice said through the telephone, dripping with a malicious, sickening amusement. "Do you want to see?" I slammed the receiver back down onto the cradle as if it had caught fire. I backed away from the desk, my chest heaving, my hands shaking violently. My rational mind was disintegrating. You cannot fight a house. You cannot punch an echo. How do you survive an enemy that uses your own voice against you? I needed a weapon. I needed a tool. I needed something solid. I began tearing through the drawers of Uncle Farid's heavy oak desk. The top drawers were filled with useless junk, dried-out pens, rusted paperclips, old invoices from timber companies dated back to 1998. But the bottom right drawer was locked. I grabbed a heavy, brass letter opener from the desktop and jammed it into the crack of the drawer, prying with all my strength. The old wood splintered, the cheap lock snapped, and the drawer pulled open. Inside was a heavy, snub-nosed .38 caliber revolver, a box of old ammunition, and a stack of leather-bound journals. I grabbed the gun first. It was heavy, cold, and smelled of gun oil. I popped the cylinder. It was empty. With trembling hands, I fumbled with the cardboard box of ammunition, dropping several brass casings onto the floor before managing to load 5 rounds into the cylinder. I snapped it shut with a satisfying click. It wasn't an escape route, but holding it gave me a microscopic sliver of courage. Then, I picked up the journals. I opened the top one. The pages were filled with Uncle Farid's frantic, chaotic handwriting. He had written in Arabic, which offered me a strange, fleeting sense of comfort in this alien nightmare, but the words themselves were terrifying. December 14, 1999, the first entry read. The isolation is getting to me. I thought building the house deep in the woods would give me peace. But the woods are too old here. They remember things. Last night, I heard someone walking downstairs. I know I am alone. But the footsteps were heavy. I flipped ahead, skipping dozens of pages. The handwriting grew more erratic, the ink pressed so hard into the paper that it had torn through in places. August 3, 2004, another entry read. They are mimics. That is what they are. They are blank things, empty vessels that wander the forest, drawn to human heat. They have no voices of their own, so they steal ours. They have no faces of their own, so they wear ours. I saw one today, standing at the edge of the tree line. It looked exactly like my brother, Hassan. But Hassan died in Cairo 30 years ago. I shot at it with the hunting rifle. It didn't bleed. It just smiled at me with Hassan's face and walked back into the trees. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry as ash. I flipped to the very last page of the journal, dated just a few months before Uncle Farid's death. I am remodeling the house. I am tearing down the solid walls. I am installing glass. Interior windows. Everywhere. They hate being watched. If you look directly at them, they freeze. They are bound by the act of observation. If I put windows between every room, I can always see them coming. I will never have to turn my back. The glass will save me. The ink trailed off into a frantic scribble at the bottom of the page. But what happens when they learn how to use the reflections? I closed the journal, my hands gripping the leather cover tightly. Uncle Farid hadn't been an eccentric architect. He had been a terrified old man, trapped in a war of attrition with entities he couldn't understand, trying to build a fortress of glass to keep them at bay. And he had lost. I need coffee, I muttered to myself. It was an absurd thought in the middle of a nightmare, but it was a human anchor. I needed caffeine to keep my brain sharp. I needed to formulate a plan to survive until nightfall, and then figure out a way to hike out at first light. I tucked the heavy revolver into the waistband of my sweatpants, covering it with my winter coat, and walked out of the study toward the kitchen. The house was completely silent again. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead, refusing to look through the interior windows into the other rooms. I walked into the kitchen, turned on the tap, and filled a rusted old kettle with water. I found a jar of instant coffee in one of the cabinets. It was probably 10 years old and smelled like dirt, but I didn't care. I turned the gas knob on the stove, struck a match, and ignited the burner. The blue flame hissed to life, offering a tiny, pathetic source of warmth. I stood in front of the stove, waiting for the water to boil, staring blankly at the wall. Directly to my right, stretching across the kitchen wall, was a massive interior window that looked out into the formal dining room. I had promised myself I wouldn't look. But human curiosity is a fatal flaw. I slowly turned my head and looked through the glass pane into the dining room. The dining room was dim, illuminated only by the gray daylight filtering through the drawn curtains. There was a long, heavy mahogany table in the center, surrounded by 12 high-backed chairs. And standing at the far end of the table, looking directly at me through the glass, was a figure. My breath caught in my throat. I reached slowly, agonizingly slowly, toward my waistband, my fingers wrapping around the cold, checkered grip of the revolver. The figure was wearing a heavy winter coat. It was wearing sweatpants. It was exactly my height, exactly my build. It was me. But it wasn't a reflection. The lighting was wrong, and there was no glass mirror on that wall, only the transparent interior window. It was a physical entity, standing in the adjacent room, wearing my exact physical form. I froze. The figure froze. I slowly, deliberately raised my left hand. Half a second later, the figure in the dining room raised its left hand. It was mimicking me. But there was a lag. A terrifying, inhuman delay. It was watching my movements through the glass, processing them, and then copying them in real time, like a predator trying to learn how to move like its prey. "What do you want?" I asked aloud, my voice echoing in the kitchen. The figure dropped its hand. It didn't mimic me this time. Instead, it slowly tilted its head to the right, until its neck snapped at an impossible, sickening 90-degree angle. The face, my face, remained completely blank, devoid of any emotion. Then, it raised its hand again, but this time, it pointed a single, elongated finger directly at me through the glass. I didn't think. I didn't rationalize. The Egyptian temper flared, burning away the paralysis of fear. I pulled the .38 revolver from my waistband, leveled it directly at the figure's chest through the interior window, and pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafening, a localized explosion in the quiet house. The interior window shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, raining glass down onto the kitchen floor with a musical, terrifying crash. I stood there, the gun smoking in my hand, my ears ringing violently from the gunshot, staring through the broken frame into the dining room. There was a bullet hole embedded in the heavy mahogany dining table. But the room was completely empty. The figure was gone. I lowered the gun, my entire body trembling. Uncle Farid's journal entry echoed in my mind. They are bound by the act of observation. If you look directly at them, they freeze. I had looked away when the gun fired and the glass shattered. In that fraction of a second, it had moved. A soft, mocking laugh echoed from the ceiling directly above me. It was the sound of my own laughter, drifting down from the second floor. I wasn't alone in the house. And the mimic wasn't just wearing my face anymore. It was learning how I fought back. The sun was going down in a few hours, and I had just destroyed the one pane of glass separating the kitchen from the rest of the house. The siege had begun. Let me tell you something about the sound of a gunshot indoors. Movies lie to you. It doesn't sound like a clean bang. It sounds like the air itself is being torn in half. It punches you in the chest, rattles the teeth in your skull, and leaves a high-pitched, agonizing whine in your ears that makes you feel completely disconnected from the world. I stood in Uncle Farid's kitchen, the heavy .38 revolver shaking in my grip, staring at the jagged hole I had just blown through the interior window. The smell of burnt gunpowder and vaporized lead hung in the freezing air, mixing with the metallic scent of my own sweat. The dining room beyond the shattered glass was empty. The mimic was gone. Okay, I whispered to myself, my voice sounding incredibly distant over the ringing in my ears. Okay. You shot at a ghost. Very smart, Yusef. Very rational. I lowered the gun and forced my finger off the trigger. I was an architect from Cairo, not a soldier. Holding a firearm felt unnatural, but putting it down felt like a death sentence. My mind was racing, trying to process the absolute insanity of what had just happened. The thing had worn my face. It had copied my movements. But most importantly, it had disappeared the exact fraction of a second I broke eye contact to blink against the muzzle flash. Uncle Farid's journal was right. They are bound by the act of observation. If you look directly at them, they freeze. But now I had a massive problem. The glass was the barrier. The interior windows were Uncle Farid's paranoid, desperate attempt to ensure he could always see from one room into the next, forcing the entities to remain frozen if they tried to approach him. By shooting the glass, I hadn't hurt the mimic. I had just destroyed my own line of sight. I had given it a blind spot. A physical hole it could crawl through without being seen. I looked at my watch. It was 3:45 p.m. In the dense, mountainous Pacific Northwest, especially under that bruised, overcast winter sky, the sun was already beginning its rapid descent. Within an hour, the forest would be pitch black. And the house would follow. I had to move. Panic is a luxury you can only afford when you are safe, and I was anything but. I holstered the revolver in my waistband and began tearing through the kitchen cabinets, moving with a frantic, destructive energy. I needed supplies, and I needed to barricade that broken window. I found a roll of heavy-duty silver duct tape in a drawer next to the sink, along with a rusted flashlight and a box of matches. In the pantry, I grabbed 3 bottles of dusty mineral water and a few cans of soup that hadn't expired yet. I shoved it all into a canvas tote bag I found hanging on the back of the pantry door. Next, I dragged the heavy, solid oak kitchen table across the linoleum floor. The legs shrieked in protest, the sound scraping against my raw nerves, until I managed to wedge the table directly up against the wall, blocking the lower half of the shattered interior window. I grabbed a thick, woven rug from the floor, hauled it up onto the table, and used the entire roll of duct tape to seal it over the jagged hole in the glass. I taped it tight, pressing the adhesive hard against the remaining pane. It wouldn't stop a physical attack, but it blocked the blind spot. If the mimic wanted to come through the kitchen, it would have to tear the rug down, which would make noise. In a house this silent, noise was my only early warning system. By the time I finished, the light in the kitchen had shifted from a dull, rainy gray to a deep, menacing violet. The shadows in the corners of the room began to stretch out, growing long and sharp. "Base camp," I muttered, wiping the sweat and dust from my forehead with the back of my hand. "I need a base camp." The kitchen was too exposed. The master bedroom was compromised, the mimic had already been outside that door. The only room in the house that had a heavy, solid wood door with a working deadbolt was the study. Plus, the study held Uncle Farid's journals. If I was going to survive the night and figure out how to escape this isolated nightmare in the morning, I needed to know exactly what he had learned over the years. I slung the canvas tote bag over my shoulder, gripped the heavy flashlight in my left hand, and drew the revolver with my right. I took a deep breath, visualizing the floor plan of the house. I am an architect. Space, dimensions, and flow are my life's work. I memorize blueprints intuitively. To get from the kitchen to the study, I just needed to walk down the main ground floor corridor, past the foyer, take a sharp left at the base of the staircase, and walk to the end of the east wing. It was a straight line, maybe 40 feet in total. A 30-second walk. I clicked the flashlight on. The beam sliced through the gathering gloom, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I stepped out of the kitchen and into the main corridor. The silence of the house pressed against my eardrums like physical pressure. I walked slowly, the floorboards groaning slightly under my boots. I kept the flashlight beam aimed straight ahead, making sure to sweep it across the interior windows that lined the hallway. "Look at the glass," I reminded myself. If you keep your eyes on the glass, they can't move. You trap them with your sight. I passed the dining room on my left. The interior window there reflected my flashlight beam back at me in a harsh glare. The room was empty. The bullet hole in the mahogany table was barely visible in the dark. I kept walking. 10 feet. 20 feet. I reached the foyer. The massive front door, the one I had left wide open earlier in my panic, was now closed. I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart skipped a beat. I distinctly remembered leaving that door open to the freezing wind. But it was shut tight, the brass deadbolt completely engaged. I hadn't closed it. Don't think about it, I told myself, gripping the gun tighter. Just get to the study. Left at the stairs. I turned left at the grand wooden staircase, my flashlight cutting down the east wing corridor. The study should have been right there, at the very end of the hall, flanked by two small decorative tables. I walked. And I walked. After 30 seconds, I realized something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. The beam of my flashlight stretched forward, but it didn't hit the heavy mahogany door of the study. It just kept going, disappearing into the darkness. I stopped, my breathing growing shallow. I shined the light at the floor, then at the ceiling. I looked at the walls. I was an architect. I knew how to measure distance by stride. I had walked at least 60 feet. The entire east wing of the house was only 40 feet long on the original exterior footprint I had seen when I parked. It was physically impossible for this hallway to be this long. The walls on either side of me were perfectly smooth, dark timber. There were no doors. No interior windows. Just a straight, endless corridor stretching out into absolute blackness. No, I whispered, the word hanging in the dead air. This is a trick. It's a psychological trick. I spun around, aiming the flashlight back the way I came. I expected to see the base of the staircase and the foyer, maybe 40 feet behind me. There was no staircase. There was no foyer. Behind me, the hallway simply stretched out into the same endless, suffocating darkness. The walls were featureless. The floor was a continuous runner of faded crimson carpet. I was standing in the middle of a corridor that defied the laws of physics, geometry, and reality. My chest tightened, a wave of claustrophobia hitting me so hard I actually gasped for air. They learned how to use the reflections, Uncle Farid's journal had said. But what happens when they learn how to alter the house? The mimic wasn't just copying voices and faces. It was manipulating the physical space of the glasswood house. It was turning the architecture into a weapon, folding the dimensions of the rooms to trap me in a maze of its own design. You think you can break me? I yelled into the darkness, my voice cracking with panic and raw Egyptian defiance. I know this isn't real. You're bending the light. You're messing with my perception. The corridor absorbed my voice, offering no echo. Then, I heard it. From the darkness far ahead of me, a sound drifted down the hallway. Click. Clack. Click. Clack. It was the sound of a woman's high heels walking on hardwood. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. Yusef, a voice called out. It was a soft, melodic voice. A voice I hadn't heard in 6 months. It was Salma. My ex-fiancée. The woman I had left behind in Cairo. Salma. I breathed, the impossible nature of the situation tearing my logic to shreds. I knew it wasn't her. I knew it. She was in Egypt. But the voice was perfect. It carried that exact slight rasp she got when she was tired. It carried the scent of jasmine and the bustling streets of Zamalek that was forever associated with her memory in my brain. Click. Clack. Click. Clack. The footsteps were getting closer. It's so dark in here, Yusef, Salma's voice echoed, sounding lost and frightened. Why did you leave me? Why did you come to this awful place? I can't see my hands. Stop it. I roared, aiming the revolver blindly into the darkness ahead of the flashlight beam. Show yourself, you blank, empty piece of garbage. Stop hiding behind stolen voices. The footsteps stopped instantly. A low, wet chuckle rippled through the hallway. It was Salma's laugh, but it was corrupted, distorted, layered with a metallic, scraping undercurrent that sounded like two rusty blades grinding together. Take a left, Yusef, my own voice whispered, entirely bypassing my ears and echoing directly inside my skull. Take a left. We're waiting for you. There is no left. I screamed, shining the flashlight wildly at the smooth timber walls on either side of me. It's a straight hallway. Look closer, the voice in my head mocked. I shined the beam to my left. The light hit the timber wall, but the shadows seemed to warp and pull apart. Slowly, like a camera lens coming into focus, the flat wall split open, revealing a heavy, dark mahogany door. It was the door to the study. It had just materialized out of the solid wood, directly to my left. I didn't pause to question it. The sheer terror of being trapped in the endless, shifting corridor broke my restraint. I lunged for the door, grabbed the brass handle, and twisted. It opened. I threw myself inside, slamming the heavy mahogany door behind me. I fumbled for the deadbolt and threw it, the loud clack of the lock offering the most beautiful sound I had heard all day. I leaned against the door, my chest heaving, my lungs burning as if I had sprinted a mile. I was drenched in a cold sweat, my hands shaking so violently I dropped the flashlight. It hit the thick Persian rug on the floor and rolled, the beam illuminating the underside of Uncle Farid's massive oak desk. I had made it. I was in the study. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed the heavy oak desk by the edges, and used every ounce of adrenaline left in my system to drag it across the room. I shoved it brutally against the locked door, wedging it tight. I piled two heavy leather armchairs on top of the desk for good measure. Base camp. I was secure. I had the gun. I had the tape. I had the journals. I took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to calm my violently racing heart. I walked to the center of the room, picked up the flashlight, and turned to look at the space. The study was exactly as I had left it. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. The rotary phone sat on a small side table where I had knocked it earlier. The air smelled of old paper and dust. But there was one architectural detail I hadn't fully processed during my first frantic visit. There were 3 interior windows in the study. One on the left wall, one on the right wall, and one directly behind where the desk used to be. Uncle Farid had turned this room into the ultimate observation deck. From here, he could see into the east wing hallway, the adjacent library, and the rear conservatory. If you look directly at them, they freeze. I raised my flashlight, slowly sweeping the beam across the room. I looked at the interior window on the left wall. It looked out into the library. The glass was intact. I could see the reflection of my flashlight beam, my own pale, exhausted face, and the towering bookshelves behind me. Normal. I turned and looked at the interior window on the right wall. It looked out into the hallway. I could see the reflection of the barricaded door, the heavy oak desk, and the leather armchairs I had stacked upon it. Normal. I swallowed hard, the silence of the room suddenly feeling heavy and expectant. Slowly, I turned to face the third interior window, the one on the back wall, looking out into the pitch-black conservatory. I aimed the flashlight at the glass. The beam cut through the darkness, hitting the pane. The reflection in the glass showed the study. It showed the barricaded door. It showed the bookshelves. It showed me, standing in the center of the room, holding the flashlight. And it showed a tall, gaunt figure standing directly behind me. The figure in the reflection wasn't moving. It was standing perfectly still, its elongated, spider-like fingers resting gently on my shoulders. Its face was blank, a smooth expanse of pale flesh with no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a terrifying, featureless void. My heart completely stopped. The blood in my veins turned to ice. I hadn't felt anything touch me. I didn't feel the weight of hands on my shoulders in the real world. I stared at the reflection in the glass, paralyzed by a terror so absolute it felt like death itself. The blank-faced entity in the mirror slowly, agonizingly slowly, raised one of its elongated fingers and pressed it against its featureless face, right where a mouth should be, making a shushing gesture. They learned how to use the reflections, Uncle Farid's journal whispered in my memory. I didn't turn around. I knew with absolute, horrifying certainty that if I turned around, there would be nothing there. The entity wasn't in the study with me. It was in the glass. It lived in the reflection. And as I stood there, trapped in a staring contest with the impossible, the reflection of the blank-faced entity slowly reached out its long, spindly arms and wrapped them around the reflection of my neck. In the real world, the study was freezing. But suddenly, a burning, suffocating pressure clamped down tightly around my actual throat, cutting off my air. I dropped the flashlight. I clawed wildly at my own neck, tearing at my skin, trying to pry away invisible hands that were choking the life out of me. But there was nothing to grab. The hands were only real in the mirror. I fell to my knees on the Persian rug, gasping, choking, my vision blurring into black spots. The last thing I saw before I passed out was the interior window, reflecting my own body convulsing on the floor, while the tall, faceless entity stood over me, watching in absolute silence. There is a specific kind of darkness that exists only when you are hovering on the jagged edge between life and death. It is not the peaceful dark of a bedroom at midnight, nor is it the heavy, suffocating black of a power outage. It is a violent, roaring darkness. It sounds like rushing water. It feels like falling. When I finally ripped my way back to consciousness, the first thing I registered was the agonizing, burning fire in my lungs. I gasped, my back arching off the thick Persian rug as a ragged, desperate breath tore through my throat. The sound I made was pathetic, a wet, rattling wheeze that echoed off the mahogany walls of the study. I rolled onto my side, clutching my neck with both hands. My skin felt bruised, tender to the touch, as if thick, iron-like cables had been wrapped around my windpipe and pulled tight. I coughed violently, tasting the metallic tang of blood and copper in the back of my mouth. I was alive. I lay on the floor for what felt like an eternity, my cheek pressed against the dusty wool of the rug, my eyes squeezed firmly shut. I didn't dare open them. I didn't know if the tall, faceless entity was still standing over me. I didn't know if the phantom hands would return to finish the job the moment my eyelashes fluttered apart. But as the roaring in my ears slowly subsided, replaced by the deafening, oppressive silence of the glasswood house, a sudden, sharp realization pierced through the fog of my panic. I had survived because I passed out. They are bound by the act of observation, Uncle Farid had written. I had looked into the interior window, and in doing so, I had engaged the entity in the reflection. It used the mirror as a bridge, translating the visual mimicry into physical force. It choked my reflection, and because I was watching it happen, the house forced my physical body to suffer the consequences. But the moment my brain was deprived of oxygen, the exact microsecond I lost consciousness and my eyes rolled back into my head, the visual connection was severed. The bridge collapsed. The phantom hands vanished. If I didn't look at the glass couldn't look back at me. I kept my eyes clamped shut, moving my hands blindly across the floor until my fingers brushed against the cold, knurled metal grip of the .38 revolver. I pulled it close to my chest, my thumb resting heavily on the hammer. Next, I swept my left hand in wide arcs until I bumped into the heavy, cylindrical shape of the flashlight. It had rolled under the edge of one of the leather armchairs I had piled against the barricaded door. "Okay, Yusef," I whispered, my voice sounding like crushed gravel. "Keep your eyes on the floor. Do not look up. Do not look at the walls." I slowly forced my eyes open, angling my chin so hard against my chest that it cramped my neck. The beam of the flashlight illuminated the intricate red and gold patterns of the Persian rug, the scuffed tips of my leather boots, and the heavy clawed feet of Uncle Farid's oak desk. I was on my hands and knees in the center of the study. The three interior windows, one on the left, one on the right, and one behind the desk, were waiting for me. I could feel them. It is a psychological phenomenon, that prickling sensation on the back of your neck when you know you are being watched. In this room, surrounded by glass, the sensation was magnified 100-fold. It felt as though a dozen invisible needles were lightly pressing against my skin. I had to blind the panopticon. I couldn't shoot the glass. I had learned that lesson in the kitchen. Breaking the windows wouldn't destroy the entities, it would only remove the physical barrier, creating a gaping hole for whatever was wandering the hallways to crawl through. I had to cover them. I had to neutralize the reflective surfaces without compromising the structural integrity of the room. I crawled on my belly like a soldier navigating a minefield, keeping my body well below the 3-foot sill line of the interior windows. I moved toward the massive, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that lined the left side of the room. I reached up blindly, my hands grasping at the dusty spines of Uncle Farid's collection. I pulled down heavy, thick volumes, encyclopedias, architectural reference books, ancient leather-bound ledgers. I piled them onto the floor next to me. Then, I dug the roll of silver industrial duct tape out of my canvas tote bag. The process was agonizingly slow and drenched in terror. I started with the interior window on the left wall, the one looking out into the library. I kept my eyes entirely focused on my own hands and the heavy books. I ripped off long strips of tape with my teeth, the loud zrzrrip sound tearing through the quiet study like a chainsaw. I took a thick, oversized encyclopedia, pressed it flat against the bottom edge of the glass pane, and taped it aggressively to the wooden frame. I didn't look at the glass. But as my knuckles brushed against the cold pane, I swear to God, I felt a vibration on the other side. A slow, rhythmic tapping. Tap. 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 Something was standing in the library, right on the other side of the window, tapping its elongated fingers against the glass, just inches away from my face. "Don't look up," I chanted internally, repeating the phrase like a manic prayer. "Do not look up. Let it tap. It is trapped in the dark. You are in the light." I taped another book above the first one. Then another. I built a solid wall of literature, sealing the glass behind pages of structural engineering and Ottoman history. With every book I added, the tapping grew more frantic, vibrating through the tape and into my fingertips. The entity was getting angry. It knew I was shutting it out. By the time I finished covering the entire left window, my shirt was soaked in cold sweat. The tapping abruptly stopped, replaced by a low, frustrated hiss that vibrated through the wooden frame. I didn't pause to celebrate. I crawled across the rug to the right wall, repeating the exact same grueling process. I ripped the tape, placed the heavy books, and sealed the glass looking out into the hallway. This time, there was no tapping. There was just a sudden, bone-chilling drop in temperature against the glass, frosting the edges of the pane before I slapped the heavy leather covers over it. Finally, I crawled to the back wall, behind the barricaded door, to face the window looking out into the conservatory. This was the window where I had seen the faceless entity. This was the window that had nearly killed me. I didn't have enough large books left to cover it quickly. I had to use smaller, thinner novels, layering them like bricks in a precarious, chaotic masonry. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the roll of tape twice. Every second I spent near that specific pane of glass, my bruised throat throbbed in phantom sympathy. I kept my eyes locked on the wooden sill, my vision swimming with exhaustion. As I taped the final book into place, completely obscuring the glass, a massive, heavy thud hit the window from the conservatory side. The impact was so violent the entire wall shuddered, and several of the books shifted precariously against the tape. I scrambled backward, raising the revolver and aiming it at the wall of books. Silence descended again. The books held. The tape stretched, but it didn't break. The panopticon was blind. I slumped against the side of the heavy oak desk, lowering the gun to my lap. The study was now a true sanctuary. 4 solid walls. No sight lines. No reflections. I had taken away their bridge. I checked my watch. 5:15 p.m. Outside the house, the sun had fully set. The Oregon wilderness had surrendered to the absolute, suffocating pitch black of night. The amber bulbs in the study cast a warm, flickering glow, but they felt fragile, like candles burning in a hurricane. I pulled Uncle Farid's leather-bound journals from my tote bag, clicking on the flashlight and placing it on the floor beside me to conserve the ambient light. If I was going to survive the next 14 hours until dawn, I needed to understand the rules of the nightmare I was trapped in. I opened the thickest journal to the middle and began to read, translating Farid's frantic, elegant Arabic script in my head. October 22, 2001, the entry read. I made a terrible mistake. I thought I was building a retreat, a place to escape the noise of the world. But I built my house on an intersection. The locals in the town of Blackwood don't come up this mountain. They call this area the Quiet Ridge. But it is not quiet because it is peaceful. It is quiet because the animals know better than to make noise here. There are things in these deep woods. They are not ghosts. They are not the spirits of dead men. They are older than that. I call them the blank ones. They are native to the ancient, untouched dark. I leaned closer to the page, my eyes straining against Farid's erratic handwriting. They have no identity of their own, the journal continued. They are voids. Like black holes, they are desperate to be filled. They feed on human perception. When they encounter a person, they study them. They learn their fears, their memories, their loved ones. They steal voices to lure you out. They steal faces to disarm you. But they are imperfect. There is always a lag, always a mistake in the translation. I thought about the figure in the dining room, raising its arm a fraction of a second after I did. The lag. The imperfect mimicry. I tried to ignore them, Farid wrote. But they are persistent. They want to come inside. They cannot cross the threshold of a locked door unless you invite them, or unless you give them a bridge. That is why I installed the interior windows. I thought if I could see them, I could keep them out. I thought my gaze would freeze them in place. But I misunderstood the physics of the blank ones. A reflection is a perfect copy of reality. To a creature that survives by mimicking reality, a mirror is a door. A window looking into a dark room is a canvas. By building a house made of interior glass, I did not build a fortress. I built a highway system for them. I invited them into the walls. A highway system, I whispered, rubbing my throbbing temples. Uncle Farid had essentially created a network of teleportation portals for these entities. They could move from the conservatory to the hallway, from the hallway to the kitchen, instantly, simply by shifting from one reflective surface to another. I flipped rapidly through the remaining pages, searching for a way to fight back. Rules of Survival, the heading read on a page near the back, heavily underlined in black ink. 1. Never answer when they call your name. Answering is an acknowledgement. It gives them permission to anchor themselves to your reality. 2. Never look them in the eyes. If you make eye contact, you surrender control of your physical form to the reflection. 3. Do not trust the architecture. They can bend space when the lights go out. They stretch hallways. They hide doors. They create dead ends where there were none. They want to trap you in a geometric loop until you lose your mind. 4. Fire and light. They hate the light. The amber bulbs keep them at bay, but the power grid here is unstable. If the lights go out, the house belongs to them. I slammed the journal shut, my stomach plummeting into a bottomless abyss. If the lights go out, the house belongs to them. Right on cue, the amber bulb in the brass lamp on the desk above me flickered. It wasn't a subtle dimming. It was a harsh, violent strobe. BZZZT, BZZZT. The light flared brilliantly white, then dropped to a dull, sickly orange, then flared again. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the flashlight and clicking it on, the beam shaking wildly in my grip. No, 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 I begged, staring up at the lamp. Don't do this. Not yet. The heavy mahogany door of the study rattled. It wasn't the frantic pounding of someone trying to break in. It was a gentle, polite knock. 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 I backed away from the barricade, leveling the .38 revolver at the heavy wood. The oak desk and the leather armchairs were pressed tightly against the frame. The deadbolt was thrown. It would take a battering ram to breach it physically. Yusef. The voice that filtered through the thick wood made my knees buckle. It wasn't Salma this time. It wasn't my mother. It was a voice I hadn't heard since I was 10 years old. Yusef, open the door, ya Ibni, my son. It was my father. My father had died of a massive heart attack in our apartment in Giza 22 years ago. I had held his hand while the paramedics tried in vain to resuscitate him. I knew he was gone. I had buried him myself. But the voice coming from the hallway was flawless. It had the exact deep, warm resonance, the slight rasp from years of smoking cheap Egyptian cigarettes, and the loving, patient tone he used whenever I was scared of the dark as a child. Dad, the word slipped out of my mouth before I could stop it. A reflex. A fatal violation of rule number 1. Never answer when they call your name. Answering is an acknowledgement. Yes, Habibi, the voice cooed from the other side of the heavy door. It's Baba. I came all this way to find you. It's so cold out here. The hallway is so long. Please, move the desk. Open the door. Let me see you. Tears streamed down my face, hot and humiliating. My rational brain was screaming at me, it's a mimic. It's a blank one. It pulled that voice from your memories. But the emotional impact of hearing my dead father's voice, pleading with me in the absolute terror of the glasswood house, was devastating. It felt like my heart was being physically torn out of my chest. You're not him, I sobbed, gripping the gun so tightly my knuckles turned white. You're a parasite. Go to hell. The voice in the hallway didn't respond with anger. It didn't roar. It just started crying. It was the sound of a grown man, my father, weeping in absolute despair. Why won't you help me, Yusef? I'm hurting. They're hurting me. Why are you locking me out? I clamped my hands over my ears, dropping the flashlight to the rug. I squeezed my eyes shut, rocking back and forth on my heels. The psychological torture was unbearable. This was how they hunted. They didn't just break down doors, they broke down your mind. They weaponized your grief, your guilt, your love, twisting it into a crowbar to pry open your defenses. Shut up, shut up, shut up. I screamed over the weeping, my Egyptian temper boiling over the fear. Read Ayat al-Kursi. Allahu la ilaha illa huwa, al-hayyul qayyum. I began to recite the throne verse from the Quran at the top of my lungs, weaponizing the faith of my childhood, using the Arabic words as a shield against the mockery outside the door. I didn't care if the blank ones understood religion or not, the recitation anchored me. It reminded me of who I was. It reminded me of Cairo, of the sun, of reality. As my voice boomed through the study, drowning out the phantom weeping of my father, the entity in the hallway changed tactics. The weeping stopped instantly. A heavy, massive weight slammed against the mahogany door. Boom. The impact was terrifying. The thick oak desk I had wedged against the door frame groaned, sliding back half an inch across the Persian rug. The two leather armchairs rattled violently. Boom. It hit the door again. This wasn't a person kicking the wood. It sounded like a car crashing into the frame. The heavy brass hinges shrieked in protest. The entity had abandoned psychological warfare and resorted to brute, impossible physical force. I scrambled backward, scooping up the flashlight and leveling the revolver at the center of the door. Come on. I roared, the adrenaline obliterating the last of my tears. Break it down. Let's see how you like lead. Boom. The desk slid another inch. The deadbolt whined, the metal grinding against the striker plate. The door was buckling. It couldn't hold much longer. And then, the absolute worst thing that could possibly happen, happened. The amber bulb in the brass desk lamp flickered one final, violent time, popping with a sharp spark of dying electricity. The light died. The entire glasswood house plunged into a darkness so absolute, so suffocating, it felt like being buried alive. The faint hum of the ancient power grid vanished. The silence rushed back in, heavy and pregnant with malice. The pounding at the door stopped. I stood in the center of the pitch-black study, my breathing ragged, my finger resting heavily on the trigger of the .38 revolver. I didn't turn on the flashlight immediately. I listened. I waited in the dark, straining my ears for any sound of movement from the hallway. Nothing. Slowly, carefully, I clicked the button on the heavy rusted flashlight. The yellow beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the barricaded door. The heavy oak desk was still wedged against the frame. The door was warped, the wood splintered near the hinges, but it was still holding. I swept the beam around the room. The books I had taped over the interior windows were still in place. The duct tape held strong. I was alone. The room was secure. I let out a long, shaky breath, lowering the flashlight slightly. Okay, I whispered. The power is out. But they didn't get in. I just have to wait. I turned the flashlight beam toward the floor, planning to sit with my back against the far wall and wait out the long, agonizing hours until dawn. As the beam swept across the Persian rug, it illuminated something that made my blood freeze solid. The beam hit the floor where the heavy oak desk used to be, right before I dragged it to barricade the door. There, sitting perfectly centered on the empty space of the rug, was a small, rusted birdcage. It hadn't been there a minute ago. I had scoured this room. I had dragged the desk over this exact spot. The floor had been completely bare. I raised the flashlight beam, my hand trembling so violently the light danced across the room in erratic circles. The door was still locked from the inside. The interior windows were still covered. There was absolutely no physical way anything could have entered the study. Yet, the birdcage sat there, mocking me. I took a slow, agonizing step forward, keeping the gun leveled at the cage. As I got closer, the beam illuminated what was inside. Sitting at the bottom of the rusted cage, staring up at me, was the severed, bloody head of a black dog. Its eyes were open, glassy and dead. I had never owned a dog in my life. But Uncle Farid's journal flashed through my mind, a detail I had skimmed over in my panic. They manipulate space. They fold the architecture. The walls mean nothing to them in the dark. A low, wet chuckle echoed from the absolute darkness directly behind me. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It wasn't coming from the glass. It was coming from inside the study. "You forgot rule number 3, Yusef," my own voice whispered, the sound vibrating inches from my right ear. I spun around, leveling the flashlight and the gun into the dark corner of the room. The beam hit the wall of bookshelves. But the shelves were separating, warping, twisting outward like melting wax. The solid timber wall of the study was silently peeling open, revealing a dark, endless, descending staircase leading deep into the bowels of the glasswood house. And standing at the top of those impossible stairs, wearing my face, drenched in the yellow light of my dying flashlight, the mimic smiled at me. "We are already inside," it whispered. There is a moment in every nightmare where the illusion of control finally shatters. It's the moment you realize you aren't running away from the monster, you are running exactly where it wants you to go. I stood in the center of Uncle Farid's study, the dying yellow beam of my flashlight trembling wildly. The wall of bookshelves, solid, heavy, built into the very bones of the house, was peeling open like a rotten wound, revealing a staircase that plummeted into absolute, suffocating darkness. And standing at the top of those impossible stairs, wearing my face, was the mimic. It didn't lunge at me. It didn't roar. It simply stood there, its head tilted at that same sickening, unnatural angle, the corners of its mouth stretched into a wide, motionless grin. Its eyes, my eyes, were flat, dead things, absorbing the flashlight beam without reflecting a single spark of life. "Get back!" I screamed, the Egyptian Arabic tearing out of my throat instinctively. Imsh! I raised the .38 revolver with both hands, aiming directly at the center of its chest, and pulled the trigger. Click. The sound was small, metallic, and utterly devastating. The hammer fell on an empty chamber. I had loaded 5 rounds into the 6-shooter in my panic earlier, and I hadn't indexed the cylinder correctly. The mimic's smile widened, stretching the skin of its face until it looked like it might tear. It didn't flinch at the sound of the gun. Instead, it slowly raised its right hand, the fingers impossibly long, ending in sharp, jagged points, and pointed down into the gaping maw of the staircase. "Come down, Yusef," my own voice echoed, not from the creature's mouth, but from the rusted birdcage sitting on the Persian rug behind me. "It's so cold up here. We have so much to show you." Then, the mimic stepped backward. It didn't walk, it glided, its feet seemingly disconnected from the physical act of moving. It slid backward into the pitch-black throat of the staircase and vanished from the beam of my flashlight. I stood frozen, my finger still hovering uselessly over the trigger. The heavy mahogany door behind me was barricaded with an oak desk and 2 armchairs. I had sealed the interior windows. I had built a fortress. And the house had simply opened a trapdoor inside it. I looked at the rusted birdcage on the floor, the dead, glassy eyes of the severed dog staring up at me. It was a psychological prop. A message. You cannot keep us out. We decide the shape of this reality now. I popped the cylinder of the revolver, my hands shaking violently, and spun it one click to align a live round under the hammer. I snapped it shut. 5 shots left. Against a creature that didn't bleed when you shot it, 5 bullets felt like 5 prayers spoken to an empty sky. I had 2 choices. I could stay in the study, trapped with a staircase leading straight into the dark, waiting for the mimic to crawl back up. Or I could go down. Uncle Farid's journal entry echoed in my mind. They create dead ends where there were none. They want to trap you in a geometric loop until you lose your mind. If I stayed, I would go insane. If I went down, I might find the source of whatever anomaly had allowed Farid to survive in this house for decades before it finally claimed him. There had to be an electrical panel. A generator. Something to bring the lights back on. Fire and light, Farid had written. They hate the light. I took a deep, shuddering breath, gripped the heavy flashlight tightly in my left hand, and walked toward the impossible staircase. The air growing colder with every step I took. It wasn't the crisp, damp cold of the Oregon forest outside. It was a stagnant, ancient chill, smelling heavily of wet earth, copper, and dry rot. I aimed the flashlight beam down the stairs. The wooden steps were narrow, steep, and covered in a thick layer of dust that looked undisturbed by human feet. There were no handrails. The walls on either side were rough, unfinished timber, bleeding sap that looked black in the yellow light. I stepped onto the first stair. The wood groaned loudly, the sound echoing endlessly down the shaft. I began the descent. 10 steps. 20. 30. I lost count. The staircase seemed to spiral downward far deeper than any normal basement should go. It felt like I was descending into the roots of the mountain itself. The silence was absolute, save for my own ragged breathing and the creak of the wood under my boots. Suddenly, the staircase ended. I stepped off the final wooden plank onto a hard, packed dirt floor. The air here was incredibly thick, pressing against my lungs like a physical weight. I swept the flashlight beam around. I was standing in a massive, cavernous subterranean space. But it wasn't a finished basement. It looked like an old, abandoned mine shaft, shored up with heavy timber beams. Uncle Farid? I whispered, my voice sounding weak and thin. What did you build this house on top of? The beam caught something metallic in the distance. I walked slowly toward it, the dirt crunching softly under my boots. As I got closer, the shape resolved into a massive, rusted industrial diesel generator. It was easily the size of a small car, covered in decades of grime and cobwebs. Thick, black cables snaked out from the top of the machine, disappearing into the dirt ceiling above, presumably connecting to the house's main power grid. Fire and light. If I could get the generator running, the amber bulbs in the house would come back on. The panopticon would be illuminated. The blank ones would be forced back into the shadows. I practically ran the last few feet to the machine, my heart hammering with a sudden, desperate surge of hope. I shined the light over the control panel. The gauges were cracked, and the metal was pitted with rust, but the heavy, manual crank wheel on the side looked intact. I tucked the revolver into my waistband, hooked the flashlight under my armpit to keep the beam steady on the machine, and grabbed the crank wheel with both hands. I planted my boots in the dirt and heaved. The wheel didn't budge. It was seized solid by time and rust. I gritted my teeth, ignoring the throbbing pain in my bruised throat, and threw my entire body weight into it. Move, you piece of garbage. I grunted in Arabic, my muscles screaming in protest. With a loud, shrieking crack of breaking rust, the wheel broke free. It turned a quarter inch. I kept pulling, turning it half a rotation, then a full rotation. The massive diesel engine inside the metal casing coughed, a dry, rattling sound. I cranked it harder, faster, ignoring the burning in my chest. Chug, chug, chug. The engine sputtered, caught, and roared to life. A cloud of thick, black diesel smoke coughed out of the exhaust pipe, filling the cavernous space with the acrid smell of burning fuel. The generator vibrated violently, the deep, mechanical thrum shaking the dirt floor beneath my boots. Instantly, a series of bare, caged incandescent bulbs strung along the timber beams overhead flickered, buzzed aggressively, and snapped on. They cast a harsh, sickly yellow light across the massive subterranean room. I let go of the crank wheel, falling back against a heavy timber support beam, gasping for air. The noise of the generator was deafening, but it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I had power. I had light. I grabbed the flashlight and pulled the revolver back out of my waistband, a wild, manic grin spreading across my face. "I'm not dead yet," I yelled over the roar of the engine. I turned around, fully expecting to see the wooden staircase illuminated in the harsh yellow light, ready to climb back up to the study. The staircase was gone. I blinked, sweeping the flashlight beam across the area where I had just ascended. There were no wooden steps. There was no gap in the dirt ceiling. The timber beams formed a solid, unbroken wall of earth and wood. The house had shifted again. It had let me down here, let me turn on the light, and then it had erased the door behind me. My manic grin collapsed, replaced by a cold, hollow dread. They want to trap you in a geometric loop until you lose your mind. I was buried alive in a brightly lit tomb. I turned back to the generator, my mind racing. If the stairs were gone, there had to be another way out. Uncle Farid wouldn't have installed a massive generator down here without an access tunnel. I began to walk around the perimeter of the cavern, keeping my back to the dirt walls, the revolver raised. The harsh yellow light from the overhead bulbs cast long, unnatural shadows that danced and twisted with every vibration of the diesel engine. As I rounded the far side of the generator, the light illuminated something I hadn't seen from the stairs. There was a hallway. But it wasn't a dirt tunnel. It was a perfectly constructed, modern hallway, jutting incongruously out of the raw earth. It had drywall, crown molding, and a faded crimson carpet runner. It looked exactly like the hallway on the second floor of the glasswood house. And lining both sides of this impossible, subterranean hallway were dozens of interior windows. It was a gallery of glass, buried deep beneath the earth. I stood at the entrance of the hallway, my stomach churning. The air coming from the corridor smelled strongly of dried lavender and copper. I didn't want to go in. Every instinct screamed at me to stay near the noisy, vibrating generator. But staying meant starving to death in the dark once the diesel fuel ran out. The hallway was the only path forward. I tightened my grip on the .38 and took a step onto the crimson carpet. The moment my boot touched the fabric, the roar of the generator behind me was instantly, completely muted. It didn't fade, it was severed, as if I had stepped through a soundproof vacuum seal. The oppressive silence of the house slammed back over my ears. I looked at the first interior window on my left. I expected to see dirt, or darkness, or maybe another empty room. Instead, the glass was perfectly mirrored, reflecting the hallway. But the reflection was wrong. It showed me standing there, holding the gun. But behind my reflection, the hallway was crowded. There were dozens of them. Tall, gaunt, faceless figures, standing shoulder to shoulder in the reflected corridor. They were entirely motionless, their smooth, featureless heads tilted at identical, sickening angles. Their elongated, spindly hands hung limply at their sides. They were packed into the hallway like mannequins in a forgotten warehouse, stretching back as far as the reflection would show. My breath hitched. I quickly looked away from the glass, staring straight ahead down the actual, physical hallway. It was completely empty. There were no figures. Just the crimson carpet and the bare walls. I looked at the interior window on my right. The reflection there was identical. A legion of faceless blank ones, standing silently behind my reflection, crowding the space, watching me without eyes. They live in the glass, Uncle Farid's journal had warned. The mirrors are their bridges. I realized, with a sickening jolt of horror, what this hallway was. It wasn't just a path. It was a holding cell. Uncle Farid had built this subterranean gallery to trap them. He had lined the walls with glass, creating an infinite loop of reflections, binding the entities to the act of observation. As long as the lights were on, and the glass remained unbroken, they were trapped in the visual echo chamber, unable to manifest physically. But the glass was everywhere. I was walking through an aquarium of monsters. "Keep your eyes forward," I whispered to myself, my voice trembling. "Don't look at the windows. Walk straight." I began to walk down the hallway. It was agonizing. The urge to look left or right, to see if the reflections were moving, was almost overpowering. I kept my eyes locked on the heavy, dark mahogany door at the very end of the corridor, about 50 feet away. Tap. 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 The sound came from the glass on my left. I flinched, biting the inside of my cheek to keep from turning my head. The tapping was polite, almost rhythmic. Tap. 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 It started on the right side now. Then, the whispering began. It didn't come from the air, it came from the glass itself, vibrating through the panes. The voices were a chaotic, terrifying chorus of stolen identities. "Yusef, help me," a little girl's voice cried out from the left. "You left the door open, architect," a deep, gravelly voice mocked from the right. "It's so cold, Habibi," my mother's voice wept from the glass just inches from my shoulder. I squeezed my eyes half shut, focusing entirely on the brass handle of the mahogany door ahead. "You're not real," I chanted aloud, my voice shaky but loud enough to drown out the whispers. "You're just echoes. You're blank. You're nothing." I was halfway down the corridor. The tapping grew louder, more frantic. The glass began to vibrate, a low, resonant hum filling the hallway. Then, my flashlight beam hit the floor in front of the mahogany door. Lying on the crimson carpet, directly in my path, was a body. I stopped. The breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a trick of the glass. It was a physical object, lying face down in the hallway. It was wearing a heavy, faded woolen sweater and dark trousers. The hair was sparse and gray. I knew that sweater. I had seen it in old photographs. Uncle Farid. I breathed. I broke the rule. I forgot about the glass. I forgot about the blank ones. The shock of seeing what looked like my uncle's corpse lying in the middle of this impossible hallway overwhelmed my logic. I jogged the remaining 20 feet, dropping to my knees next to the body. I reached out and grabbed the shoulder of the woolen sweater, hauling the figure over onto its back. The body rolled over heavily. It wasn't Uncle Farid. The face was completely, perfectly smooth. No eyes. No nose. No mouth. It was a blank one, wearing Farid's clothes. And as I stared down at the featureless visage in absolute horror, the smooth flesh where the mouth should be split open in a jagged, bloodless tear, forming a ragged, impossible smile. The blank one's hand shot up with terrifying speed, its elongated, claw-like fingers wrapping around my right wrist with a grip like cold iron. The strength was unbelievable. It squeezed, crushing the bones in my wrist until my fingers went numb. The .38 revolver slipped from my grasp, hitting the carpet with a dull thud. The entity had played dead. It had used the sweater to lure me out of my narrow field of vision, forcing me to engage with it physically. I screamed, rearing back and driving my heavy leather boot directly into the center of the entity's featureless face. The impact was like kicking a sack of wet cement. The face yielded slightly, the blank flesh denting under my boot, but the creature didn't let go of my wrist. Instead, it pulled, dragging itself up off the floor toward me, its jagged, torn mouth stretching wider. "Found you," my own voice rasped from the ragged hole in its face. Around us, the hallway erupted. The glass panes on both sides of the corridor began to crack. Spidery fractures shot across the interior windows, groaning under immense pressure. The blank ones trapped in the reflections were pushing against the barrier. The amber lights overhead flickered violently. I drove my left elbow into the creature's throat, or where its throat should have been, breaking its grip for a fraction of a second. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, desperate to put distance between us. The blank one wearing Farid's sweater rose smoothly to its feet, moving with that awful, gliding motion. It stood between me and the mahogany door. It stood between me and the exit. The glass around us shrieked. A massive pane to my right shattered outward, raining shards onto the crimson carpet. A long, spindly, gray hand reached out of the empty window frame, grasping the edge of the drywall. The bridge was broken. They were coming through. I looked at the revolver lying on the floor between me and the entity. It was 5 feet away. Too far. If I lunged for it, the creature would be on me before my fingers touched the metal. I looked back down the hallway, toward the entrance where the generator cavern used to be. The wall was solid. There was no escape. I was trapped in the gallery, unarmed, and the glass was breaking. The blank one tilted its head, its featureless face staring at me, savoring the absolute terror radiating from my body. It took a slow, deliberate step forward, its elongated fingers twitching. I didn't have a weapon. I didn't have a plan. But I had the flashlight. Fire and light. They hate the light. I gripped the heavy, rusted metal cylinder of the flashlight with both hands. I didn't aim the beam at the creature's face. I aimed it directly down at the crimson carpet, right at my own feet, creating a blinding pool of intense yellow light around my body. "Come on, then." I roared, the primal panic giving way to sheer, desperate fury. "Come step in the light." The creature hesitated. It stopped its advance, its elongated fingers recoiling slightly from the edge of the illuminated circle on the floor. It hissed, a wet, metallic sound of pure hatred. The glass on the left wall shattered completely. 3 more long, spindly hands reached out from the darkness of the empty frame, gripping the wall, pulling the featureless bodies of more blank ones into the physical world. The gallery was breached. The trap was sprung. And my flashlight battery, glowing hot against my palms, had only minutes left before it died. There is a terrifying intimacy in knowing exactly how much time you have left to live. I wasn't bleeding to death. I wasn't falling from a great height. I was standing in a freezing, subterranean hallway, staring at a circle of yellow light on the crimson carpet, knowing that the moment the rusted flashlight in my hands ran out of battery, my existence would end. The heavy, metal casing of the flashlight was growing uncomfortably warm against my sweating palms. The beam, which had been a brilliant, piercing yellow just 10 minutes ago in the generator room, was already beginning to soften at the edges, bleeding into a sickly, pale orange. It was dying. And the things in the dark knew it. I stood perfectly still, my chest heaving, listening to the agonizing chorus of breaking glass. Crack, shatter, screech. The interior windows lining both sides of the long corridor were failing. The entity wearing Uncle Farid's heavy woolen sweater had backed away from the edge of my light pool, its featureless face turned slightly downward, shielding its pale, malleable flesh from the direct glare. It hissed again, a sound that resonated in my dental work, like tinfoil tearing. To my left, the entire pane of glass finally gave way. It exploded outward, showering the crimson carpet with jagged, glittering shards. From the black void of the empty window frame, 3 long, spindly arms pulled themselves into the physical world. They were the color of wet ash, the skin pulled so tightly over the bone that I could see the joints grinding together. Behind them, the blank ones began to emerge. They didn't climb through the window like humans. They poured through it, their bodies unfolding and elongating like insects escaping a cocoon. Their faces were smooth, terrifying blanks, but as they hit the air of the hallway, the flesh began to boil and shift. They were trying to pull faces from my mind. One of them began to form the sunken eyes and sharp cheekbones of my grandfather. Another started to mold into the shape of a woman I had passed in the airport in Portland 2 days ago. They were clumsy. They were desperate. But there were too many of them. God is great, I whispered in Arabic, my voice trembling so violently the words barely formed. Allahu Akbar. I looked at the heavy .38 revolver lying on the carpet. It was 5 feet away, sitting just outside the protective ring of my flashlight beam. Between me and the gun stood the Farid mimic, its elongated fingers twitching in anticipation. If I moved the light to grab the gun, the circle of safety would shift, leaving my back exposed to the entities crawling through the windows. If I dove into the dark, they would tear me apart before my fingers even grazed the metal grip. But staying still was a guaranteed death sentence. The battery was fading. The beam was shrinking. In Cairo, when the traffic gridlocks and the heat of the summer sun makes the asphalt boil, you don't wait for the cars to move. You force your way through. You carve a path with sheer, unapologetic aggression. I couldn't outthink these things. I couldn't out-geometry a house that folded space. I had to go through them. I tightened my grip on the heavy, cylindrical flashlight. You want my face? I roared, my voice booming down the claustrophobic corridor, raw and ragged. Come take it. I didn't dive for the gun. I didn't step backward. I raised the flashlight with both hands, pointed it directly at the featureless face of the Farid mimic, and charged. The sudden, blinding intensity of the focused beam hitting the entity's pale flesh had an immediate, violent reaction. The blank one shrieked, a high, piercing wail that sounded like tearing metal. The smooth skin of its face where the light struck began to smoke and blister, blistering as if I had pressed a branding iron against its skull. It threw its elongated hands up to shield its non-existent eyes, stumbling backward blindly. I didn't stop. I slammed my shoulder directly into its chest. It was like hitting a frozen slab of meat. The impact jarred my collarbone, sending a shockwave of pain down my spine, but the sheer momentum of my charge knocked the creature off balance. It fell backward onto the crimson carpet, its long limbs tangling in Uncle Farid's oversized sweater. I didn't pause to watch it fall. As I collided with the mimic, I dropped my center of gravity, sliding to my knees on the rough carpet. My right hand shot out into the dark, my fingers frantically grasping at the floorboards. Cold, checkered metal. My hand closed around the grip of the .38 revolver. The weight of it in my palm was the most intoxicating sensation I had ever felt. I scooped it up, rolled over my right shoulder, and sprang back to my feet, the flashlight beam sweeping wildly across the hallway. The corridor had descended into absolute chaos. The glass on the right wall shattered. 2 more entities pulled themselves through the frame, their bodies twitching and jerking as they adjusted to the physical dimensions of the hallway. To my left, the entity wearing my grandfather's half-formed face lunged at me, its gray, spindly hands reaching for my throat. I didn't hesitate. I leveled the revolver and pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the confined space of the subterranean hallway. The muzzle flash illuminated the corridor in a brilliant, strobe-like burst of white light. The heavy .38 caliber hollow-point bullet caught the grandfather mimic directly in the center of its shifting, malleable chest. The impact threw it backward into the wall, but there was no blood. Instead, a thick, black, viscous fluid erupted from the wound, smelling strongly of ozone and burnt copper. The creature let out a distorted, gurgling sound and collapsed onto the shattered glass, its body writhing uncontrollably. For left, I screamed, racking my brain for the bullet count. I swung the flashlight toward the end of the hallway. The heavy mahogany door, the only exit, the only physical barrier left, was 20 feet away. 20 feet. 6 strides. Move! I ordered myself. I sprinted. The heavy winter coat dragged on my shoulders, but I ran with the desperate, frantic speed of a hunted animal. A hand shot out from the darkness to my right, gripping the fabric of my coat sleeve. The fingers were icy cold, the strength inhuman. I felt myself being yanked sideways, my boots slipping on the carpet. I didn't stop to aim. I shoved the barrel of the revolver directly into the mass of pale flesh attached to the arm and fired. Bang! The grip instantly released. The creature shrieked, stumbling back into the shadows of the empty window frame. 3 bullets left. I stumbled forward, regaining my balance. 15 feet. The hallway was filled with a cacophony of stolen voices. The air vibrated with weeping, screaming, and mocking laughter. "Why are you running, Yusef?" a voice whispered directly into my right ear. It was Salma's voice again, dripping with honey and venom. "There's nowhere to go. We are the walls. We are the floor. Shut up." I roared, swinging the flashlight blindly. The beam caught a tall, gaunt figure stepping directly into my path. It was the Farid mimic. It had recovered from the light burn, its face heavily blistered and smoking, the ragged tear of a mouth stretched open in a furious, silent scream. It lunged at me, both arms extended, its elongated fingers aiming for my eyes. I dropped to my knees, sliding on the crimson carpet, ducking under its sweeping arms. As I slid past its legs, I drove the heavy steel cylinder of the flashlight upward, smashing it directly into the creature's kneecap. The bone, or whatever cartilage substituted for it, snapped with a sickening crunch. The mimic collapsed to the side, its long limbs flailing wildly, tearing at the carpet. I scrambled to my feet, my chest heaving. 10 feet. The mahogany door loomed ahead of me, massive and imposing. But standing directly in front of the door, blocking the brass handle, was another entity. This one was different. It wasn't trying to form a face. It wasn't trying to look human. It was a massive, towering bulk of pure, featureless gray flesh, easily 7 feet tall. Its shoulders touched the walls on either side of the corridor. It was a physical barricade, conjured by the house to stop me from reaching the exit. I aimed the flashlight directly at its chest. The light hit the pale skin, but it didn't burn. The beam was dying. The yellow circle was fading into a sickly orange, the battery finally giving out. The light was no longer a weapon. The massive entity didn't move. It simply stood there, an immovable wall of dead flesh, waiting for the light to die. I raised the revolver, leveling it at the center of the creature's mass. 2 bullets left. "Move," I said, my voice dangerously calm. The entity didn't flinch. Slowly, the smooth flesh of its massive head split open, revealing a vertical, jagged tear that served as a mouth. "You are out of light, architect," it rumbled. The voice wasn't stolen. It was a collective, echoing chorus of a dozen different voices speaking at once, men, women, children, all layered over one another in a sickening harmony. "And you are out of time." The flashlight flickered, buzzed, and died. Absolute, suffocating darkness slammed down on the hallway. The only illumination came from the faint, distant amber bulbs near the generator room, 50 feet behind me. In the pitch black, I could hear them moving. The soft, wet sliding of bare feet on the carpet. The scratching of elongated fingers against the drywall. They were closing in from behind. I was standing 3 feet away from the massive entity blocking the door. I couldn't see it, but I could smell the overpowering stench of copper and dried lavender radiating off its skin. I could feel the icy cold emanating from its massive body. I had one chance. A gamble so reckless it bordered on suicidal. I didn't shoot the creature in the chest. I knew the hollow-point bullets wouldn't stop a mass of flesh that size. I needed it to move. I aimed the revolver slightly downward, angling the barrel toward the entity's left thigh, and pulled the trigger. Bang! The muzzle flash briefly illuminated the hallway in a blinding white strobe. For a fraction of a second, I saw the massive creature stagger, its left leg buckling under the impact of the bullet. In that exact microsecond of illumination, I memorized the location of the brass door handle. I didn't wait for the darkness to settle. I threw my entire body forward, diving to the right, aiming for the small gap created as the creature stumbled to its left. My shoulder slammed hard into the entity's side. It felt like hitting a wall of frozen rubber. The creature roared, a deafening, multi-layered shriek of rage, and swept a massive arm blindly in the dark, catching me across the back. The blow threw me forward. I crashed face first into the heavy mahogany door, my nose smashing painfully against the wood. I ignored the blood pouring down my face. I blindly slammed my hand against the wood, feeling frantically for the brass hardware. My fingers brushed cold metal. The handle. I gripped it, twisted it violently, and shoved my shoulder into the wood. The door didn't budge. It was locked. No, no, no. I screamed, rattling the handle with manic desperation. Behind me, the massive entity recovered its balance. I heard the heavy, wet slap of its hands hitting the doorframe on either side of my head. It was boxing me in. The other blank ones were swarming up the hallway, their hissing voices filling the dark. I had one bullet left. I didn't have time to aim. I pressed the barrel of the .38 directly against the brass locking mechanism of the heavy mahogany door, turned my face away, and pulled the trigger. Bang! The brass lock exploded in a shower of sparks and jagged metal splinters. A piece of shrapnel sliced across my cheek, but I didn't care. I kicked the door with the flat of my boot. The heavy mahogany swung open with a loud, shrieking groan. I threw myself through the doorway, tumbling head over heels onto a hard, stone floor. I scrambled frantically, kicking the heavy door backward with both feet. It slammed shut with a thunderous crack. I sat up, my chest heaving, and slapped my bloody hand against the floor, feeling for a locking mechanism. There was a heavy iron deadbolt on the inside of the door. I shoved it into the striker plate, sealing myself inside. For 10 agonizing seconds, I sat in the pitch black, my back pressed against the cold mahogany, waiting for the massive entity to batter the door down. Silence. There was no pounding. No hissing. No stolen voices. It was as if the hallway on the other side of the door had simply ceased to exist. I sat there, gasping for air, the adrenaline slowly draining from my system, replaced by a deep, throbbing ache in my bruised throat, my bloody nose, and my battered ribs. I had survived the gallery. I was out of bullets. I was out of light. Slowly, my eyes began to adjust to the darkness. The room I was in wasn't completely pitch black. High above me, filtering through what looked like an immense, domed ceiling, was the pale, ghostly light of the Oregon moon. I staggered to my feet, my legs shaking uncontrollably. I wiped the blood from my chin with the sleeve of my heavy coat and looked around. I wasn't in a basement anymore. I wasn't in a hallway. I was standing in the center of a massive, cavernous greenhouse. The architecture was staggering. It looked like a Victorian conservatory, built entirely of wrought iron and thousands of individual panes of glass. It soared at least 50 feet into the air, a massive crystal dome buried inexplicably somewhere within or beneath the footprint of the glasswood house. The moonlight poured through the glass roof, casting a lattice of intricate, skeletal shadows across the stone floor. But it was what the conservatory contained that made my breath catch in my throat. The room wasn't filled with plants. It was filled with furniture. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of living room sets, dining tables, armoires, and beds were scattered chaotically across the massive stone floor. But they weren't arranged like a home. They were arranged like theatrical sets. I walked slowly forward, my boots clicking softly against the stone. To my left was a perfect replica of my childhood bedroom in Cairo. The small wooden desk, the faded Zamalek Football Club poster on the wall, the exact pattern of the bedspread. It was immaculate. To my right was the living room of Uncle Farid's house, the exact same heavy antique furniture covered in white dust sheets, the exact same interior windows. I kept walking, wandering through the impossible labyrinth of memories. There were rooms I didn't recognize. A 1970s kitchen with yellow wallpaper. A hospital waiting room. A sterile, modern office cubicle. They feed on human perception, Farid's journal had said. They learn your fears, your memories, your loved ones. This wasn't just a conservatory. This was the archive. This was the nesting ground. This was where the blank ones built the environments they needed to perfectly mimic the minds of the people they trapped. They didn't just steal faces, they stole the spaces that made you feel safe, storing them here like props in a twisted, non-Euclidean theater. I walked toward the very center of the massive glass dome. There, sitting alone in a wide clearing of stone, was a single, heavy wooden chair. Sitting in the chair, illuminated by a direct shaft of pale moonlight, was a figure. It wasn't a tall, faceless entity. It wasn't a mimic wearing my face. It was an old man. He was wearing a faded, heavy woolen sweater. His hair was thin and gray. He was slumped forward, his chin resting on his chest, completely motionless. "Uncle Farid?" I whispered, my voice echoing loudly in the massive glass dome. I took a step closer, my hand dropping instinctively to the empty revolver at my side. The old man slowly lifted his head. The face was Uncle Farid's. I recognized the deep lines around his mouth, the sharp, aristocratic nose, the dark, tired eyes. He looked exactly as he had in the photographs my mother kept, only older, far older, and worn down to the bone. He looked at me, a profound, agonizing sadness swimming in his eyes. "You shouldn't have come down here, Yusef," the old man whispered. The voice wasn't distorted. It wasn't metallic. It was perfectly, terrifyingly human. "You're dead," I said, my voice trembling. "The lawyer told me. You died 6 months ago." The old man in the chair offered a slow, bitter smile. "Did I?" he asked quietly. "Or did the house simply decide it was done playing with me, and needed a new architect?" He slowly raised his hands, resting them on the wooden armrests of the chair. And as the moonlight shifted, cutting across his hands. I saw them. His fingers were pale. They were smooth. And they were at least 4 inches longer than any human hand should be. There is a saying in the old neighborhoods of Cairo, muttered by grandmothers when the night gets too quiet: the devil does not steal your soul, he convinces you to hand it over. I stood in the center of the massive, subterranean glass conservatory, the pale Oregon moonlight washing over the stone floor. Surrounded by a chaotic museum of my own memories and Uncle Farid's stolen life, I stared at the old man sitting in the heavy wooden chair. He wore Farid's face, Farid's heavy woolen sweater, and Farid's exhausted, sorrowful posture. But those fingers, pale, jointed, and extending 4 inches past the limits of human anatomy. They rested on the armrests like the legs of a starved, white spider. "You're not him," I said. My voice was a raw, bleeding rasp, ruined by the phantom hands that had strangled me in the study, but it held steady. The Egyptian temper, that deep, stubborn refusal to be humiliated, was the only thing keeping my knees from buckling. The old man tilted his head. The movement was perfectly fluid, lacking the jerky, insect-like lag of the other blank ones. This creature was older. It had been digesting my uncle for a long, long time. "I am the house, Yusef," the Farid mimic said. The voice was rich, mournful, and entirely human. "Farid is an ingredient. A very stubborn, very intelligent ingredient. He fought for 20 years. He built the walls. He installed the glass. He thought he could contain us by watching us. But he forgot that a cage is a two-way street. He spent so much time staring into the dark, making sure we were there, that he forgot to live in the light." The mimic slowly stood up from the chair. He didn't glide like the others. He walked. He put one booted foot in front of the other, mimicking the heavy, tired gait of an old man with arthritis. It was a terrifyingly perfect performance. When his mind finally broke, the mimic continued, pacing slowly across the stone floor. When the isolation and the paranoia finally cracked his foundation, we didn't just take his face. We took his understanding of space. His architectural genius. Before Farid, we were just shadows in the woods. We could mimic a voice, a shape. But Farid taught us how to build. It gestured with one of those sickeningly long hands to the massive glass dome soaring 50 feet above us, and then to the scattered, perfectly recreated rooms below. My childhood bedroom. The 1970s kitchen. The hospital waiting room. "We are a collective, Yusef," it said, stopping 10 feet away from me. "But an archive needs a curator. And a house this vast needs a new architect. Farid's mind is fading. It is fully consumed. The geometry of the house is beginning to slip. That is why the hallway shifted on you. We need fresh material. We need a mind that understands tension, structure, and design. We need you. You want me to build for you?" I spat, gripping the empty .38 revolver in my right hand. It was useless as a firearm, but it was a heavy piece of steel. I could still use it to cave a skull in. I build homes for people. Not terrariums for parasites. The Farid mimic smiled. It was a gentle, loving smile. It was the exact smile my uncle used to give me when I showed him my drawings as a kid. The emotional manipulation was physically sickening. "You don't have a choice, Habibi," the mimic whispered. From the shadows of the mocked-up rooms around us, they began to emerge. Dozens of them. The blank ones. Tall, gaunt, featureless figures sliding out from behind my childhood bed, crawling over the mahogany dining table, stepping out of the sterile hospital waiting room. They didn't make a sound. They moved with that awful, gliding motion, forming a massive, tightening circle around the center of the conservatory. They weren't trying to wear faces anymore. They had dropped the disguise. They were raw, pale, empty voids, and they were all turning their smooth, featureless heads toward me. The glass keeps the outside world out, Yusef, the Farid mimic said, its voice echoing in the massive dome. And it keeps the inside world entirely under our control. Your mind will expand this place. You will design endless corridors, impossible staircases, rooms that fold into themselves. You will live forever in the architecture. I looked around the circle of monsters. I was unarmed. I was exhausted. I was bleeding from a shrapnel cut on my cheek, and my throat felt like it was lined with broken glass. But I am an architect. And an architect knows that every structure, no matter how imposing, has a critical weakness. The glass keeps the outside world out, the mimic had said. I looked up at the massive wrought iron dome. The moonlight was pouring through thousands of individual panes of glass. Uncle Farid had built this place underground, or perhaps the house had sunk it here. It didn't matter. The entities were bound by reflections. They used glass as a bridge, a highway, a canvas. The glass was the containment field that allowed them to manipulate this localized reality. If you want to destroy a panopticon, you don't fight the guards. You break the lenses. I needed to shatter the dome. I couldn't reach it. It was 50 feet in the air. I had no gun. I had no rocks. I looked frantically around the scattered sets on the floor. My eyes landed on the 1970s kitchen set, about 30 feet to my left. It was a perfect recreation of a kitchen from an old American magazine. Linoleum floors, yellow floral wallpaper, and a heavy, vintage gas stove. In rural, isolated areas like this, especially decades ago, stoves weren't connected to municipal gas lines. They ran on massive, pressurized propane cylinders tucked into the cabinets. I remembered the box of matches I had shoved into my coat pocket back in the real kitchen upstairs. You want my mind? I shouted, stepping backward, keeping the Farid mimic in my line of sight while inching toward the 1970s kitchen. You want me to design for you? The blank ones tightened the circle, gliding forward silently. I'll give you a free consultation, I roared, my voice cracking. Your structural integrity is a joke. I turned and sprinted. I abandoned the center of the room and bolted for the 1970s kitchen set. The sudden, explosive movement caught the entities off guard. They hissed, a collective, deafening screech that rattled the glass dome high above, and swarmed after me. I vaulted over a mid-century modern coffee table, my boots slamming onto the linoleum floor of the mocked-up kitchen. I crashed into the heavy vintage gas stove, my hands frantically gripping the old, rusted dials on the front panel. I twisted them all. All 4 burner dials, and the main oven valve. Hiss. The sound of pressurized propane rushing out of the ancient, hidden cylinder beneath the counter was loud and aggressive. The smell of rotten eggs, the chemical odorant added to the gas, instantly flooded the small space. I reached into the deep pocket of my heavy winter coat, my fingers scraping against lint and cold fabric. Where were they? Where were the matches? A long, pale hand slammed down onto the stove right next to my wrist. I gasped, spinning around. One of the faceless blank ones had reached me. Its elongated fingers scrabbled at the metal, trying to grab my arm. I brought the heavy steel frame of the empty .38 revolver down like a hammer, smashing it directly into the creature's joint. Bone cracked. The entity shrieked and recoiled, thrashing backward. But the others were pouring into the kitchen. The Farid mimic was walking slowly through the crowd, its face twisted into a mask of furious, unadulterated hatred. Stop him, the mimic roared, the human voice finally cracking, revealing the metallic, grinding horror underneath. My fingers found the small cardboard box in my pocket. I yanked it out. The gas was pooling heavily in the air. The kitchen smelled like a bomb waiting to go off. Propane is heavier than air. It was sinking, filling the floor, wrapping around my boots, expanding outward into the conservatory. I pulled a single wooden match from the box. Eviction notice, I snarled. I struck the match against the abrasive strip on the side of the box. The small, brilliant yellow flame flared to life. I didn't throw it immediately. I waited one terrifying heartbeat, making sure the foreign mimic saw exactly what I was holding. The old man's face contorted in absolute, primal terror. The blank ones around him froze, their featureless heads snapping toward the tiny flame. Fire and light. They hate the light. I tossed the burning match directly over the open burners of the gas stove, turned, and threw my entire body in a desperate, sprawling dive over the kitchen counter, aiming for the heavy, solid mahogany dining table sitting in the adjacent mock-up room. I hit the floor, curling into a tight ball, wrapping my arms around the back of my neck, and squeezed my eyes shut. The explosion didn't sound like a movie. It was a physical force. A deafening, earth-shattering boom ripped through the conservatory. The shockwave hit me like a speeding truck, lifting me off the stone floor and slamming me hard against the underside of the heavy mahogany table. A wall of blistering, searing heat washed over my back, singeing the heavy fabric of my winter coat. The concussive blast echoed inside the massive, enclosed glass dome, magnifying the pressure tenfold. Then came the sound I had prayed for. The screech of buckling iron. The catastrophic, cascading thunder of a million panes of glass shattering simultaneously. The shockwave from the propane explosion blew the roof off the panopticon. Jagged shards of glass, ranging from tiny splinters to massive, guillotine-like blades, rained down from the sky, smashing against the stone floor, the furniture, and the wooden table shielding me. The noise was apocalyptic. And beneath the sound of the breaking glass and the roaring fire, I heard the shrieks. The blank ones were screaming. It wasn't the sound of voices. It was the sound of a vacuum losing its seal. Without the glass, without the reflective containment that anchored their localized geometry, the physics of the house collapsed. I opened my eyes. The air was filled with thick, black smoke and dancing orange flames from the burning kitchen set. I crawled out from under the mahogany table, wincing as a dozen small cuts on my hands and face stung violently. I looked up. The 50-foot glass dome was gone. The wrought iron framework was twisted and blackened, reaching up like the skeletal fingers of a dead giant. But through the gaping, jagged holes in the ceiling, I didn't see dirt. I didn't see the basement of the house. I saw the night sky. I saw the dark, swaying branches of the Oregon pine trees, and the pale, bright disk of the moon. The conservatory hadn't been deep underground. The house had folded space, convincing my mind I had descended dozens of flights of stairs, when in reality, the structure had just led me out into a massive, standalone greenhouse hidden in the woods behind the main property. The geographic manipulation was shattered along with the glass. The cold, freezing, damp air of the real world rushed into the burning ruin. It was the sweetest thing I had ever tasted. I looked around the floor of the conservatory. The fire from the propane explosion had caught the dry wood of the furniture sets. The archive of memories was burning to ash. But the blank ones were gone. There were no bodies. No tall, gaunt figures. No foreign mimic. Without the reflective glass to act as their bridge, the sudden influx of the chaotic, uncontained real world had dissolved them back into the formless shadows they came from. I wasn't going to stick around to see if they could reform. I dragged myself to my feet. My entire body felt like it had been beaten with baseball bats. My ribs throbbed, my wrist was deeply bruised, and my coat was scorched, but my legs worked. I climbed through the wreckage of the burning rooms, navigating the piles of shattered glass and flaming wood. I reached the outer wall of the conservatory, where the iron framework met a low stone retaining wall. I hoisted myself up, ignoring the burning pain in my muscles, grabbed the twisted iron beams, and pulled myself through one of the massive holes in the shattered dome. I fell onto the wet, muddy ground outside, rolling down a small embankment into a patch of freezing snow and pine needles. I lay there for a minute, looking up at the sky, letting the freezing rain fall onto my bloody face. I was out. I was in the real world. I slowly pushed myself up onto my knees and looked back. The glasswood house loomed about 100 yards away, silhouetted against the dark sky. From this angle, I could see the massive, domed structure attached to the rear of the property, blazing with a fierce, orange fire. The flames were licking at the dry timber of the main house. Without the local fire department, which was miles away and totally unaware, the entire property was going to burn to the ground. Let it burn. Let the glass melt into slag. Let the woods reclaim the ashes. I turned my back on the fire and began to walk. The hike to the town of Blackwood was a brutal, agonizing nightmare. It took me 5 hours to navigate the winding, pitch-black mountain road. I walked through the freezing rain, my boots slipping in the mud, shivering so violently my teeth chipped against each other. I survived on pure, unadulterated Egyptian stubbornness. I refused to die on a cold mountain in America after surviving a house full of demons. When I finally stumbled into the outskirts of the town just after dawn, a local sheriff's deputy found me sitting on the curb outside a closed diner, covered in soot, blood, and mud, clutching an empty .38 revolver. They took me to the hospital. They asked 1,000 questions. I told them I woke up, smelled gas, and barely escaped before the house exploded. I told them I grabbed my uncle's old gun in a panic. I didn't tell them about the interior windows, the mimicking voices, or the faceless things in the glass. They wouldn't have believed me, and I was too exhausted to care. The police eventually drove up the mountain. They confirmed the house was a total loss, burned down to the stone foundation. They found the melted remains of my rental car in the driveway, and they chalked the slashed tires up to vandalism by local kids before the fire. 2 days later, the lawyer arranged a flight for me, and I went home to Cairo. That was 6 months ago. I am back at my architectural firm in Giza. The noise of the city, the honking, the shouting, the relentless, chaotic thrum of millions of people living their lives, is the greatest comfort I have ever known. I embrace the noise. I let it wash over me. But I am not the same man who left. I don't like the quiet anymore. If my apartment gets too still at night, I turn on the television and leave it blaring until morning. And my architectural style has changed drastically. My partners complain that my designs have become too heavy, too brutalist. I use solid concrete, brick, and thick, unbroken walls. I refuse to use glass interior doors. I refuse to install large mirrors in the hallways. Because sometimes, when I am alone in the bathroom washing my face, and the water is running, and the apartment is just a fraction too quiet, I will catch a glimpse of my own reflection in the mirror above the sink. I will look at my face. I will look at my eyes. And I will wait, just for a terrifying heartbeat, to see if my reflection blinks a fraction of a second after I do.